My cousin Nate has been in the Coast Guard for over a decade, and he's not the kind of person who lies or makes things up. He's one of the most straightforward people I know. Very grounded, not superstitious, not into horror, just a practical guy who enjoys boats and order. He shared this story with me in the summer of 2022, and I asked him to recount it more than once because it was so unsettling. Every time, the details remained consistent. This occurred back in 2017 when he was assigned to a lighthouse off the coast of Maine for a 2-week maintenance rotation. The place was called Matinus Rock, and it was extremely remote. Access is only possible by boat or helicopter. It's essentially a jagged rocky island featuring a single lighthouse and one auxiliary building used for storing fuel and maintenance equipment. There's no connection to the power grid, no plumbing, and barely any cell signal. While the lighthouse itself is automated, it requires occasional manual upkeep, which is why the Coast Guard sends personnel out there every year or so. Typically, this is a solo assignment, but due to strange electrical failures the previous year, they decided to send 2 people for this trip, Nate and another man named Russell. The initial few days passed uneventfully, marked by wind, boredom, and repetitive tasks. During daylight hours, their duties involved checking the beacon mechanics, testing the emergency batteries, refueling the diesel generator, and removing layers of salt corrosion from the metal interior. Come nightfall, they would read, eat simple meals, and pass the time playing cards. The isolation was expected, but there were no red flags. Then, on the 4th night, Nate awoke around 2 a.m. feeling peculiar. Not sick, not in pain, just sensing that something was amiss with the atmosphere. The air felt heavier than usual, akin to standing in a room just before a thunderstorm, yet the sky outside was clear and silent. He sat up and surveyed his surroundings. It was dark. Then he noticed it. There was no rotation from the beacon. The lighthouse was supposed to emit a sweeping light beam every few seconds, even during maintenance. A failure of the light was a significant concern. He got up and shook Russell awake, and the 2 made their way up the narrow spiral staircase to the top of the tower to investigate. Upon arrival, they found the gears rotating the beacon were functioning, but the light itself wasn't turning. Something was jammed in the mechanism. A large, dark piece of cloth, resembling a blanket or an old coat, wedged deep into the gear assembly. It was soaked, covered in a slimy, mossy substance, and smelled strongly of rotting seaweed and mildew. They were both baffled. The door had been locked, the windows sealed. No wind or birds could have done it. It defied logic, so they removed the fabric, tossed it outside into the wind, and returned to bed, figuring it was just some strange, isolated incident. The following night, however, the exact same event transpired. Around the same hour, just after 2 a.m., Nate woke and saw the beacon wasn't rotating. They went up and discovered another piece of cloth jammed into the same mechanism. This time, it wasn't the same type of fabric. It was smaller, appearing to be an old-fashioned scarf or shawl. It was red, frayed at the edges, soaked through with what looked like ocean water, and even had tiny crustaceans clinging to it, as if it had recently emerged from the sea. Nate stated that was the moment things ceased feeling coincidental. They checked the doors, windows, and supply closet, but everything was secure. Now they began to wonder if someone was intentionally messing with them, or worse, if something had gotten into the lighthouse and was deliberately trying to disable the light. From that night on, they started blocking the stairwell with heavy crates. After their final check upstairs, they meticulously locked the beacon room and the bottom entrance. But on the 7th night, something happened that Nate still refuses to try to explain. He said he was lying in bed attempting to fall asleep when he heard Russell whispering from across the room. But Russell wasn't speaking to Nate. He was murmuring to the corner of the room, uttering strange, disconnected phrases, as if someone were standing there. Nate leaned up and asked what he was saying. Russell blinked slowly, looking confused, and insisted he wasn't saying anything. Later that night, however, Nate woke again and found Russell sitting by the window staring down at the rocks below. When questioned, Russell said he thought he had seen someone standing down there on the rocks the previous night, barely visible at the edge of the beacon light. He claimed it seemed as though someone was watching them before disappearing when the light rotated away. After that, things began to deteriorate. Russell grew progressively stranger each day. He stopped sleeping, stopped talking much, and would just stare out the window for hours. When Nate asked if he was all right, Russell would only mutter about noises in the wall or about hearing voices emanating from the stairwell. On the 9th night, they both heard footsteps on the stairs, not the usual creaking caused by the wind, but distinct, slow, deliberate footsteps, one after another, descending from the beacon room above. Nate glanced over and saw Russell standing at the bottom of the stairs, frozen and staring upwards. He asked if Russell had gone up there, and Russell just shook his head. Then he asked Nate if he had. Neither of them had moved. They stood listening, but the footsteps ceased. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. That night they shoved a dresser in front of the bedroom door and slept with knives beneath their pillows. On the 11th night, they were awakened again by the beacon failing. This time, when they reached the top of the lighthouse, the beacon room door was wide open, not just unlocked or cracked, but fully swung open as if someone had kicked it in. Wind howled through the opening. Inside, the beacon wasn't merely stopped. It had been deliberately interfered with. The bulb was unscrewed and placed upright in the center of the room. Nate explained that the bulb was industrial grade. You couldn't just unscrew it by hand without significant effort. Nate stared at it, terrified, while Russell continued to mutter that someone had done this. Then Nate felt something brush against his back. Something cold. He spun around, but no one was there. Russell had turned pale. He just kept pointing at the wall, whispering that he saw a hand emerge from the bricks. They fled back down the stairs and locked themselves in the bedroom. Nate didn't sleep at all. Russell began rocking back and forth in the corner, whispering to someone who wasn't present. The next morning, Nate used the emergency sat phone to call for an early pickup, citing a serious mechanical failure. The boat arrived that afternoon, but here's the most unsettling part. When they arrived, the crew inquired about the distress call they had received at 2:12 a.m. that morning. But Nate had never made any such call. He hadn't touched the phone until daylight. The deckhand mentioned they'd received a garbled transmission filled with static, and a voice stating something about someone being there with them before it abruptly cut out. Russell didn't speak during the entire ride back. He quit the Coast Guard a few months later and never told anyone what truly happened out there. Nate still performs maintenance duty occasionally, but he says he will never, ever go back to Madness Rock. Story 2. This occurred during the COVID lockdowns, a time when everyone was becoming weary of being confined and was experiencing cabin fever. I was single then, swiping on Tinder and messaging people while watching movies and shows. What else was there to do on a weeknight during lockdown? I started chatting with a girl I'd been following on Instagram for years. Her name was Sophia, and she goes by Soph. We both live in Suffolk County, Long Island, New York, roughly 20-30 minutes from the Hamptons and about an hour from Montauk. One night, we were both bored and agreed to hang out. Conveniently, she lived only about 5 minutes away. I picked her up, and we drove to a nearby park that was closed. We just sat there and drank White Claws. I immediately got the impression that she was a bit rebellious, but in an appealing way. She seemed like the type to hop fences and trespass, things like that. We connected quickly, and within less than an hour, she suggested driving out to Montauk and walking the cliff walk around the lighthouse. Technically, the lighthouse grounds were closed after sunset. I believe they might have been closed generally during lockdown as well, though I'm not entirely sure. Regardless, I immediately agreed. I enjoy adventures like that. So we finished our drinks and drove all the way out east to Maid Point. Upon arrival, she instructed me to park in the lighthouse parking lot. I hesitated slightly, but she seemed confident that there would be no security on a random Tuesday night during lockdown and off-season. I didn't see any other cars, so I trusted her and parked. She mentioned she had done this before, even prior to the pandemic. We parked and had another White Claw in the parking lot. I would nervously glance around periodically, checking for any security vehicles, and she would tell me to relax. Eventually, we began walking toward the lighthouse. Seeing a lighthouse up close at night, gazing up at it, is fascinating, but also somewhat eerie. I can't quite explain it, but there's a kind of eerie, spine-tingling quality to it. We took a slightly indirect route towards the actual entrance, so we wouldn't be walking directly into the light beam and potentially be spotted. This was my first time ever being at the Montauk Lighthouse. She led us straight to the cliffside behind the lighthouse, where a series of rocks formed a sort of trail known as the Cliff Walk. We navigated solely by the light of our flashlights. Perhaps there were supposed to be lights down there, but that night, most everything was dark except for a few lights near the front entrance, and of course, the lighthouse beam itself. As we started making our way along the cliff walk, carefully watching our step, eventually Soph, who was walking behind me, called out my name. I turned, and she was pointing her light behind her, revealing someone else on the rocks behind us. With both our lights shining on him, it was easier to make him out. He was wearing a coat and had a hood pulled over his head. He appeared to be a black man, but we couldn't determine his age or any other details. I called out, asking if he worked there, but he didn't answer. He also didn't move. I followed up by saying, "We're going to leave. Sorry." I was mostly worried he was a security guard or something, and we were going to get into trouble. But then the guy spoke. He asked, "Y'all want to buy some Coke?" Discovering he wasn't a security guard, but simply a random person was hardly reassuring. If anything, it was more unsettling. Why was this creepy guy following us? Why was he even there? I replied, "No, man, we're good," and gestured for Soph to keep moving. I let her go in front of me and we pressed onward. As we walked, the guy started moving too. He didn't say anything else like, "You sure?" He remained silent, but it seemed he matched our pace. I would occasionally glance back with our lights, and he'd be the same distance away. It was the strangest, most uncomfortable feeling. It made the rest of the walk tense. We reached the end of the cliff walk and hurried through the grass back to the car. The guy from before was still following, keeping pace with us. We heard him call out something. It sounded like, "Where are you going?" This guy was clearly looking for trouble. I didn't want to provoke anything, so I didn't respond, and I told Soph not to either. We walked quickly side by side to the car, and that's when we noticed two more guys walking over from behind us as well. I didn't want to run, as that would likely cause them to chase us. But one of the other guys called something over to us too. I didn't catch what it was. We got to the car and scrambled inside, and Soph and I both screamed when we realized the three guys were right next to the car now. I locked the car immediately. I'm certain that just seconds before, two of them had tried opening different doors. I put the car in reverse, essentially the only direction where I wouldn't risk hitting any of them with the car. They kicked and hit my car as I backed out, but they didn't bother chasing us once we started moving. On the ride back, I know both of our hearts were pounding, and after the adrenaline subsided, we were both quiet. We called it a night after I dropped her off. We ended up hanging out many times after that, and we're still in touch today. But honestly, that night still unsettles me. It was too close for comfort to something really bad happening. My friends think it was a gang, maybe the Crips. Whatever it was, I have absolutely no interest in going back out there at night. Story 3. My name is Gregory. This is a story my old friend Ian has told me many times about something that happened to him many years ago. Recently, I asked him for a detailed written version that he gave me permission to share online because I always found it so unsettling. Ian was the kind of guy you only had to meet once to know he was the real deal. In his 50s, solid build, skin weathered from decades working in salt air. He worked in marine salvage and coastal infrastructure. Basically, whenever something broke near the water, Ian was one of the people you'd call to fix it. But he wasn't just a contractor. He'd been a diver, a ship technician, even spent time doing remote inspections for the government. He'd seen pretty much everything. So when he told me this story, I didn't doubt it for a second. He said it happened back in 2013 when he was hired by a small county in Washington state to do a structural inspection on an old, decommissioned lighthouse. The county had inherited the property years earlier and didn't know what to do with it. Developers wanted to tear it down, historians wanted to preserve it, and no one wanted to pay for either option. So Ian's job was straightforward. Go there alone, assess the place inside and out, and determine if it was even safe to restore. The lighthouse was situated on a remote rock island about an hour off the mainland. It wasn't a large island, just a chunk of stone and dirt, maybe 300 feet wide, with nothing but the lighthouse itself, a generator shed, and some rusted old scaffolding from decades ago. The place hadn't been used in years and wasn't exactly a tourist destination. There wasn't even a dock, just a small ledge where a small Coast Guard boat could offload someone at high tide. Ian packed lightly. Food for 4 days, a sleeping bag, some tools, a clipboard, and a two-way marine radio. The plan was simple. He'd get dropped off Monday morning, do a full walkthrough by Wednesday, and call in for pickup Thursday afternoon. He didn't give a second thought to going alone. He'd done this sort of thing dozens of times before. When he first arrived, the place was quiet, cold, cloudy, but calm. The air carried that usual mix of salt, metal, and decay you expect from something abandoned for decades. The lighthouse itself was tall, perhaps 50 feet, built in the early 1900s. It featured the classic spiral staircase inside, leading up to the beacon room. The glass lens hadn't functioned in decades, but the structure itself was solid. Ian performed his usual safety checks. Support beams, stair integrity, window fittings. The floorboards on the lower level were warped but walkable. The second floor was a storage room, empty except for some rusted metal cabinets. The third floor housed a tiny sleeping area that hadn't been used in decades. He ended up laying out his sleeping bag on the ground floor near the generator room for warmth and shelter from the wind. The first night was uneventful, Ian said, almost too quiet. You don't realize how noisy the world usually is until it's silent. There were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of waves against the rocks outside, just the wind, and even that was soft. On the second day, thick fog rolled in. Ian awoke to a completely white world outside. Visibility was less than 5 feet beyond the window. He described it as unlike any fog he'd seen before. It was so dense it seemed solid, like a wall. But he didn't think much of it, knowing the area often experienced heavy fog. He spent most of the day taking notes while moving through the upper stairwell. That's when he noticed the first oddity. Halfway up the staircase to the beacon room, there was a maintenance closet built into the wall. He tried opening it on day one, but the hinges were so corroded it wouldn't budge. But now it was slightly ajar. Just an inch, perhaps, but enough to tell it had been moved. He figured the moisture in the air might have caused it to shift, but it made him uneasy. The inside of the closet was pitch black, and when he pushed the door wider, he saw something sitting in the back corner. A wooden box, about the size of a lunchbox covered in a kind of damp moss, as if it had recently been underwater. He didn't open it. He just closed the door again and made a mental note to report it. That night, something woke him. He said it wasn't a sound exactly, but rather the absence of sound, as if everything had stopped. Then he heard footsteps on the metal stairs above. At first, he thought an animal had gotten inside, but then he realized they weren't descending. The footsteps were ascending. Whatever was in the tower was climbing upwards. He turned on his flashlight and stared at the stairwell entrance, waiting. But nothing happened. Eventually, the sound stopped, and silence returned. The next day, he searched the entire place, top to bottom. He checked every room and every closet. He even climbed onto the roof but found nothing out of the ordinary except that box. It was now sitting outside the closet, halfway into the stairwell, still covered in moss. He said he stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to decide what to do. Finally, he picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. The wood was saturated with moisture, but the lid wouldn't open. It was nailed shut. He didn't want to tamper with it too much, so he left it at the base of the stairs and went outside for some air. That's when he noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt around the lighthouse. Bare footprints, not boots or shoes, but wet bare feet from the north side of the building toward the cliff edge, and then stopping. The footprints didn't circle back. They were just 10 or 12 impressions from bare feet in the mud, ending at a sheer drop into the sea. He said he stood there for a long time, trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had come ashore, but the only boat scheduled was his return ride, still a day away. He considered using the radio to call for an early pickup, but the fog was so thick that they probably wouldn't be able to navigate back. He went inside and secured every door and hatch, then wedged the stairwell shut with an iron pipe and tried to sleep. That night was worse. Around 1:30 a.m., he heard the door to the upper beacon room slam shut violently. He said the force shook dust from the ceiling. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks on the inside wall of the tower. Not on the front door or window, but on the wall itself, like someone standing just inches behind the plaster, tapping their knuckles against the brick. Ian didn't move. He lay there frozen until the knocking stopped. When the sun came up, he checked everything again. The box was gone and the closet door was fully open. At this point, it was clear he wasn't alone there. Ian used the radio to call for immediate extraction. The fog was still heavy, but he told them it was a medical issue. They said they'd try to get a boat there within a few hours. He packed everything and waited by the landing ledge. The fog didn't lift. In fact, it grew thicker. He waited for nearly 7 hours, unable to see more than a few feet in front of him as the sun went down and the air grew cold. He heard someone walking behind him in the gravel near the base of the lighthouse, but when he turned around, there was no one there, or he simply couldn't see anyone through the fog. He stayed near the edge of the cliff until he heard the boat horn in the distance. They pulled him out just after dark. The deckhand who helped him aboard asked why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ian told him the lighthouse was unsafe and should be sealed off. He filed a brief report back at the office, stating the structure was compromised and not fit for entry, but he omitted the footsteps, the box, and everything else. He told me later he didn't mention them because he genuinely considered the possibility that he was simply losing his mind due to isolation. This was around the end of what Ian had sent me in writing. Ian never went back to that lighthouse. He finished out his projects for the year and quietly stopped taking field contracts. Within a year, he stopped accepting contracts altogether, saying he wanted to focus on work on dry land from then on. When I asked if it was because of the lighthouse, he just shrugged and said he'd seen enough out there. I pressed him once, just once, about what he really thought happened on that island. He looked me straight in the eye and said something that has kind of stuck with me ever since. He said, "Some places are meant to be left alone. They just need time and silence." That was all he'd say. I tried looking into the lighthouse myself a while back, but I couldn't find much. The coordinates he'd jotted down in his notes don't correspond to any listed structure. The county records mention a decommissioned tower somewhere off the coast, but there's no official name and no accessible history. It's as if he was never really there, and that's the part that unsettles me most. Not what Ian said, but what nobody else ever did. I honestly don't know whether I hope Ian was just, for whatever reason, losing his mind on that island or not.